Ray Rasmussen was only 29 when she was murdered in her Los Angeles home after a violent attack by an unknown assailant on February 24, 1986. At the time of her death, she was working as a nurse and had been married to John Ruetten for only 3 months. John tried calling Sherry that day but couldn't reach her. When he got home, he noticed her car was gone and there was broken glass on the driveway. The door was also open. When he went inside, he found his wife lifeless on the floor. Sherry had bruises and bite marks on her body. One such mark on the inside of her arm was swabbed for saliva. A vase was used by her killer to strike her on the head. She was also shot in the chest. Blood smudges were on various objects in the home as well as on the walls. It was assumed to be a burglary gone wrong based on the state of the crime scene, and because there was a string of reported robberies and burglaries going on in the area at the time. 2 men were said to have been behind these crimes, so the theory was they were also responsible for Sherry's murder. But there were some peculiarities. For example, Sherry was shot 3 times. 1 shot to the chest would have been enough to kill her. Her BMW was missing, which happened to be a gift from her husband, and her marriage certificate had disappeared. Sherry was very well loved and didn't have any enemies to speak of, except one. Friends and family of Sherry told investigators about a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. She was John's ex-girlfriend who had a veritable obsession with him. Sherry told her father that she would come to their home asking for John, and even went so far as to confront Sherry at her work at the hospital, witnessed by several people. It upset Sherry very much. Sherry's loved ones, including John, insisted that Stephanie could be behind the murder, but the investigation hit a wall. It's important to note that Stephanie was an LAPD officer, which may have played a role in the investigation into Stephanie's possible involvement to have gone nowhere. The Sherry Rasmussen case went cold for over 20 long years. At the end of 2004, the LAPD expanded its cold case division, and a closer look was taken at the Sherry Rasmussen murder. A very astute criminalist named Jennifer Butterworth looked at the Rasmussen file and noticed that there were DNA samples taken at the crime scene removed from the list of evidence. She found them and they were analyzed. 1 month later, they got proof that a female bit Sherry, but there was no match to anyone in the system's national database. But this was a huge step forward in the case because it proved that these 2 supposed men who were committing these robberies and burglaries around the time and in the area of Sherry's murder were not behind her death. This botched burglary was in fact staged by a female assailant who had knowledge of how a burglary scene should appear. There was a stack of electronics at the foot of the stairs, among other such clues, that had fooled investigators into concluding that Sherry caught the burglar or burglars in the act and they killed her. Stephanie was a cop at the time of the murder, and in 2009 was still in law enforcement but worked as a detective in the art theft division. She had joined the force back in 1982 and began her career in robbery and homicide. Detectives suspected that she may be behind Sherry's death, and they started to surveil her. One day they caught her at a Costco having pizza and soda. It was their opportunity to surreptitiously get her DNA. Once she discarded her trash, it was quickly bagged and analyzed, and the DNA on Stephanie's straw matched the DNA found on the bite mark on Sherry's body. Detectives wanted to speak to Stephanie without arousing suspicion, so they told her they needed her to sit in on an interrogation which would require her to hand over her gun. She complied, totally oblivious to the fact that she would be the one in the hot seat. When they sat her down in the interrogation room, she noticed there was no suspect. The detectives began to engage in questioning her about Sherry, John, and Sherry's unsolved murder. At first, Stephanie downplayed her relationship with John, but investigators already did their homework and knew the extent of it and their history. As they skillfully and methodically asked Stephanie questions, the truth began to emerge that John was much more important to her than she tried to make it initially seem. She started to catch on that her dark past had finally caught up with her. They told Stephanie that they had a sample of DNA from the crime scene and asked if she would voluntarily submit her own to be eliminated as a suspect. She responded with, Maybe. Stephanie's proverbial goose was cooked, and this was the beginning of the end for her. Authorities had enough evidence to arrest her on the spot, and she was charged with first-degree murder. There was so much evidence against Stephanie. Her DNA on Sherry's body. 2 shell casings were also recovered at the crime scene, and they came from the same type of gun Stephanie owned at the time and had claimed was stolen a few days after the murder. There was also her history with John as a motive. She had written a letter to John's mother professing her love for John and her disbelief he had broken up with her. At trial, John testified that he and Stephanie were intimate dozens of times before his marriage to Sherry and twice after her murder. Little did he know he was sleeping with the enemy. And let's not forget the many times Stephanie confronted Sherry at her home and at work. She even said to Sherry one day that if she couldn't have John, no one would. Stephanie was convicted of Sherry's murder. When John gave his victim impact statement, he was very emotional when talking about Sherry, and one can only imagine how Stephanie must have seethed with anger and jealousy when he spoke so highly of her arch-rival. John talked about how much he loved and adored Sherry, and how he hated Stephanie. John candidly stated in court, quote, "The fact that Sherry's death occurred because she met and married me brings me to my knees." All of Stephanie's appeals have been denied. Her sentence was 27 years to life. She will be eligible for parole in 2039, at which time she will be 79 years old.